Hey everybody, this is Off Leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. We are coming back to you with another segment in our series on Too Big to Win, how the military-industrial complex and the neocons keep America losing, by Erik Prince himself. You can find it at im1776.com, this article. You've got to study this. We're going into the next segment, Erik. You talked in the last segment a little bit about your Afghanistan plan. You signaled it in the Wall Street Journal with a suggestion from your buddy Steve Bannon in the spring of 2017. Trump loved it. Tell us a little bit more about that plan and how things could have ended differently in Afghanistan.
Basically, we wanted to replicate what worked in the first 6 months with a special operations approach.
6 months of 2000.
The first 6 months after 9/11.
After 9/11, yep.
When special operations was hunting Al-Qaeda and Taliban, largely off-leash, with a rapid targeting cycle. And then you had 19 years of very conventional military replicating the same Soviet battle plan down to occupying the same bases that the Soviets did. And that didn't work. So we wanted to have a ground mentoring plan, in this case using Special Forces veterans, now contractors, living with, attaching with the Afghan ground forces, providing them reliable air power, some combination of contracted and Afghan aircraft, and third, to really get the combat logistics right, because all the parts, fuel, ammunition, food, payroll for the Afghan forces was all routed through something that was way over indulged to the Afghans. And all that did is sprout massive corruption. So you had 50% extra Afghan headcount in Gulf soldiers, officers skimming the pay. The same with fuel, the same with ammo, the same with parts. All to the detriment of the Afghans. And it was terrible, even on medevac. If an Afghan was wounded, he was 7 times as likely to die versus a NATO guy. So if you're going to fight with a partner nation, then treat them as partners. And so our plan would have, basically I would have used a big three accounting firm to take care of the distribution of those funds and logistics, run it like Walmart, not leave it to the Afghans and not leave it to the Defense Department, to do that significantly cheaper, and to eliminate the Gulf soldiers, and again, a rationalization to take what they were spending tens of billions on and take it down to a couple of billion. Even the energy is so frustrating that the yearly burn rate to just be there was around $60 billion a year, or about more than the entire UK defense budget just to be in Afghanistan. And tens of billions of that was fuel. And the cost of importing fuel from the Mediterranean by ship to Karachi, trucking it up into Afghanistan, generated about 30% of the Taliban's budget, because they would toll the fuel going by. The Taliban's budget was around $600 million a year. It was a third in fuel taxes, a third in mining taxes, and a third in drugs. So the Taliban was funded with about $600 million. They never got the outside aid or military weaponry that the U.S. had given to the Mujahideen when they were fighting against the Soviets. Certainly not Stinger missiles. There was not one coalition aircraft lost to a manpad or a missile over all Afghanistan. A couple helicopters lost to RPGs. That's more of a lucky shot, not manpads. The Soviets were losing 1 aircraft a day. We never had anything like that. Back to fuel. So at the same time we're spending billions of dollars shipping fuel to where it costs $250 a gallon by the time it gets into the tank of a Humvee or a truck or a tank. There's fuel in the ground in the north of Afghanistan that had been properly explored and drilled and proven and cemented when the Soviets left. And instead of one general saying, I want $20 million, we're going to drill those wells right now, and $100 million to buy a refinery, it would have provided all the hydrocarbons, the Jet A, diesel, and gasoline that the coalition needed. And the bottom half of the barrel would have, HFO, the heavy fuel oil, would have fueled all the big generators you needed to actually power Afghanistan and drag them a few decades ahead in terms of economic development. But no general did that. And there was some anti-carbon bias from the idiots in AID, et cetera. So they wanted to do green energy when they have cheap hydrocarbon in the ground.
They wanted electric powered tanks, no doubt.
Yeah. So
Incredible.
so again, the litany of failure, and the one time I saw Trump while he was president was at a Veterans Day event, oddly enough, in New York, November 11, 2019. And he saw me, he said, "Erik, you were right. I should have listened to you on Afghanistan." I said, "Mr. President, there's still time. We can still pull this out." And I love the guy, but he never really controlled his national security apparatus.
Well, so your plan was logical, innovative, entrepreneurial, all of which was a threat to the neocons.
Worse than that,
Okay.
It was much cheaper. It
Right.
was 95% cheaper.
95%. So all of that, so you're a threat. Someone like you is a massive threat to the neocons. So the guys who had embedded themselves in the Trump administration, who never should have been let in the first place, they basically blocked your Afghanistan plan.
Yes.
Correct? And instead, they just kept on doing what they've been doing for 20 years, despite Trump's efforts to reform it.
I remember specifically in the presentation, I said, I want to prevent the helicopter off the rooftop moment that we saw in 1975. I was 6 years old when Saigon fell in 75. And I remember as a little kid, the helicopter off, that actually wasn't the embassy, it was actually a CIA safe house. But we get the idea.
I was 10, I remember.
That's a bad time for America, and having thousands of Afghans chasing a C-17 clinging to the wings as it's taking off, that is not a good look for a superpower. So all our enemies around the world see that and say, those Afghans were supposed to be their allies, and the U.S. just blew them off.
How did that moment in August of 2021, the disastrous Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan, how was that the fault of the neocons? Spell that out for us.
Because they lacked the self-introspection to say, holy shit, guys, we have spent trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, and we're still failing. Maybe we should tack. If you're in a sailboat and you're getting blown way off course and you're not making it towards your objective, maybe it's time to tack the boat. And nobody had the gall or the intellectual curiosity to even say, maybe there's other ideas. And for Washington, for all their talk of diversity, they really don't like diversity of thought.
That's the wrong kind of a diversity. So, but that did serve as the prime example of corruption and failure in the Pentagon, in our military, in the CIA, was that moment in August 2021. And nothing's changed since.
And the only guy that's been court-martialed was Stu Scheller, the young Marine officer, lieutenant colonel, who just said, hey, this is bullshit. He was at that point, he was in charge of like Marine Corps infantry training. And he said, if some of my soldiers out on the range lose rifles, they're going to be written up. They're going to be punished. We left, was it $83 billion worth of military equipment on the ground, turned over to the Taliban? Nobody was punished. Nobody was demoted. Nobody was even...
Except the guy who called them out for
Except the one lieutenant colonel who had the gall to say, I'm calling bullshit on this. And that's wrong. And that is, you wonder why there's a recruiting problem in the military? Because people join an organization that is either winning or wants to win, is moving in that direction. And when there is a complete absence of accountability, again, we've talked about lots of generals. All the generals that started World War II or in the leadership roles of the U.S. military at the beginning were not in power really for much more than a year and a half.
Well,
so we changed from peacetime generals to wartime generals. Over 20 years of GWAT, there was never of that house cleaning. And so you promoted all the same people that were managing their way up. And I would even argue in like 2005, 6, usually the Army promotes 3 out of 4 captains to major. They started promoting 95%. So instead of cutting the bottom quarter turds,
right,
They promoted everybody.
Everybody moves up.
Everybody's equal.
Right.
And that's just not the case.
And we're surging in recruitment of men who wear skirts these days under the Biden administration. That's the one area of recruitment that is on the rise. God help us. So now, based on your piece, okay, and I'm just reminding people, too big to win. You've got to digest this piece. It's an extraordinary condemnation of the neocons and our foreign policy for 40 years. When Reagan won the Cold War, and we should have had this peace dividend, but instead, the military-industrial complex decided, you know what? We need to build NATO out. We need to have a constant sense of tension between us and Russia through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and then conflicts across Africa and now the Middle East. But to me, the proof of your thesis here is Ukraine, where Russia has basically looked at NATO for years, expanding, growing. And again, you said Russia should never have invaded. It never should have happened. There shouldn't have been hundreds of thousands of lives lost. But what in the hell are we doing there? Ukraine, to me, is the proof of your thesis in this piece. Take us through that.
And it seems Washington wants to fight to the last dead Ukrainian. And it's getting ugly. And as I predicted before, as the fields dry, it's now May. When they're really dry in June and July, it's tank season. Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle in history, happened in July and August of 1943. 6,000 tanks. I think the Russian army is going to have a significantly successful summer. And so what should have been ended a year and a half ago, freeze the lines, forget Crimea. Ukraine can focus on being a smaller European-focused country. Mm-hmm. Even freeze the lines and have a north-south demarcation like you have in Korea. Mm-hmm. But try to out-conventional war the Russian bear is a fool's errand. And so mm-hmm. It is primarily NATO's responsibility to do this, but NATO really hasn't been a treaty. It's not been a mutual alliance. It's been a protectorate. It's been an American protectorate.
Right.
And that's also ridiculous that we are on the hook taxpayer-wise for that. When Germany is spending, all those countries, when Trump took over, 5 of 28 NATO countries spent 2% on their defense. Now it's up to 11 out of 28. Well, that means there's still 17 that don't even spend 2% of their GDPs on defense. And so we're spending 3.5% on defense.
And we've gone trillions and trillions in debt because of what we're spending, in part, because of what we're spending there at our bases across Europe.
To reinforce the nonsense of the Washington military-industrial complex.
Right.
Again, it's not right. It's not fair. Trump was right to call bullshit on it. And what's really bad is that the U.S. systems aren't that good. And so all we're really doing now is making the Russian army a lot better, a lot more lethal. Their response time, if they get a stimulus for a target, it used to take them hours to fire artillery accurately. Mm-hmm. Now they're down to a few minutes. So if you're going to do something and you're in range of Russian artillery or rockets, you got to move and displace very quickly.
So they're applying their lessons from their field experience real time.
Of course. The combat is the ultimate cauldron of learning, mm-hmm. and with a very, very high cost of failure. So for the neocons, Lindsey Graham saying, "Well, we're burning up the Russian military." Yeah, okay, we might be burning up a lot of their own equipment. A lot of people on both sides are dying unnecessarily. The war should have been frozen, and I even offered a deterrent to the Biden administration before the fighting started, before the invasion. In December of 2021, I knew the Ukrainians didn't have much of an air force. And again, thinking historically, what did the United States do to Britain in its hour of need during the early days of World War II, before the U.S. was involved?
Lend-Lease.
Lend-Lease. And how do we help China defend against Japanese bombing aggression in China, the nationalist Chinese, not the communists? And that was called the Flying Tigers. The U.S., I knew, because a friend sent me the list of 200 aircraft that the U.S. had already announced was going to retire. 50 F-15s, 50 F-16s, 42 A-10s. A-10 being the best anti-tank aircraft ever built, literally built for destroying Russian tanks on the Eastern Front. They're going to be retired in 2022, flown from active U.S. squadrons out to the desert in Davis Monthan Air Force Base and parked for all eternity. Written off $0 to the taxpayer. I said, oh, fine. Take those 140 aircraft, fly them to Ukraine, announce that they now have a bigger Ukrainian Air Force. You can fly in with contractors.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter that there's a lot of very capable air defense. So ejection seats are for that level of Air Force showing up would have deterred a Russian invasion. Because in the early days of the invasion, the Russians had a lot of logistics problems. They had the 20, 30 miles of columns. That kind of Air Force would have mauled an invader. But I would even argue that that kind of Air Force showing up would have deterred the Russians from crossing the line in the first place. And you could have said, Joe Biden, and I made all this, and I gave it to a JSOC contact with my name completely removed so they can't play the I Hate Erik Prince card.
Right.
To say, make two things. A, Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Fine. Point taken, done. Second, they're going to have a kick-ass Air Force, so if you do try something, they're going to have the means to defend themselves.
Right.
That program would have cost like $800 million, including a lot of old U.S. weapons that could have been donated to arm an Air Force. Because again, the aircraft were of zero value. Plus fuel, plus pilot costs, $800 million versus hundreds of billions of dollars that we have spent. And Ukraine is much worse off. And all we've succeeded in doing is killing hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainian soldiers unnecessarily.
Europe's got 90% of the risk and has only taken on 10% of the cost. And it goes back to what Trump was pressuring them to do. None of them want Trump reelected because they don't want that pressure on them again.
It's free rider syndrome.
And that's the reason why we're in this position. And it's the neocons.
And we're so in debt.
And when we see the Lindsey Grahams of the U.S. Senate in full agreement with Chuck Schumer, you know the neocons are actively engaged in trying to get us in direct war with Russia. Am I correct?
Yes, and the people that are doing that are not the ones whose sons and daughters are serving. And that's wrong. When I talk about that in the article, when the Romans fought, they had a hell of a time with Hannibal, and at the Battle of Cannae, they lost 80,000 Romans in a country of a couple million people. So think of that; they had huge casualties. And when the Roman Senate met a couple weeks later, it was down 40% in numbers. Why? Because the Romans elites served in their military. They defended the Republic. Our elites do not serve anymore.
It was their responsibility. They all had something. They all had skin in the game.
Noblesse oblige applied, and that doesn't seem to apply anymore. And in the same way, Afghanistan should have been, right? So after that Battle of Cannae in Rome, in Hannibal exfils, he goes back to Carthage. They get up in the Roman Senate, and this is Carthagio delende est. Carthage must be destroyed. The Romans sent Scipio Africanus, and he destroyed Carthage. And he salted the earth. And they never had a problem with that again. That's what should have been done in Afghanistan to smash and annihilate any remnants of the Taliban, and certainly any remnants of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or even in the tribal areas of Pakistan, to say, enough. Don't do this in the United States, because next time we'll come back and kill 5 times as many. That's what should have happened, but instead we got 20 years of waste and a really pathetic attempt at nation building, which blew up in our faces.
All right.
We spent trillions of dollars and replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. No one's held to account.
That's a hell of a way to put it. That's true. We replaced the Taliban
So
with the Taliban.
every American soldier that went and did their job, good on them for doing their job. It's their politicians that screwed them back in Washington.
So let's exit this series with this, because this piece, it's a lot to absorb, but it's a significant piece, because as I had told you earlier, I learned as a young guy in my career about the neocons. And hell, they were doing it in Vietnam. I mean, they did it through, the post-Cold War era, as you've taught us through this piece. All right. It's 2025. You're in charge.
God help us.
How do we take
God
out...
help our nation's enemies.
Exactly. How about our nation's enemies in the Capitol? How do we destroy the neocons? How do we change this?
I think first we have to give a bright spotlight on their failings to say, if this is what our elite universities, this tenured, papered class of people that are in all these think tanks and all these defense policy positions, if this is the fruits that they're bearing, then it's time to find a different bush, right? Because that's a bunch of weeds, and we don't need that. So let's point out their successes and their failures. Pretty easy to find a long list of failures.
A lot of power. They put a lot of money into their lobbyists. They pay a lot of politicians on Capitol Hill. I mean, that's a force that's been in place for decades and decades.
I said it in the article. I said, these people that, because it even adopted the counterterrorism approach to warfare. Because they want to have this surgical approach that if we just cut off the head of the snake will never regrow a head. And to that paradigm is a complete repudiation of actually how warfare works. Because if you look back to the wars of ancient Greece or Rome or the wars in Europe, World War I, World War II, the American Civil War, the winning side killed 30% of the other guy's military age manpower. As brutal as that sounds. That's exactly what happened in Germany. 30% of its manpower were done. That's what defeated it. This idea that you can just kill the head of the snake,
take out the leader,
this scientific drone approach to warfare.
Right.
No, drones have a place, but you destroy an enemy by taking out their manpower, their logistics, and their finance. The bottom of the pyramid, not the top. So these neocons that want to have this phony CT approach to warfare without consequences, I say we draft their firstborn children and send them to frontline combat units and let them live with those decisions that they're making.
With something at stake. Well, and you talk at length about the effects on our economy. And, the devastation that this has had on us. We're $34 trillion. We've got bases all over the world. Trump says, if you don't pay your fair share, we may not defend you against Russia. And of course, the elites in Washington, their heads blow up hearing Trump talk about that because it's an apostasy against the neocon principles.
Because the neocons want to keep the spend up as high as possible because it's a grift for them.
Because they're all getting rich.
It's a stimulation of demand signal for them to make money.
And so, Ukraine.
People say, Erik, you're a contractor. I'm not a U.S. government contractor anymore. All we did was offer to do it a hell of a lot cheaper and a hell of a lot smarter. And that's clearly not what Washington wants.
And you're not only a unicorn in the defense contracting world, where you used to be, but you're a threat to them because there's entrepreneurialism to it. There's logic. There's efficiency. And that's a threat to their existence, their very existence and identity.
As I pointed out in the article, I was born in the summer of 1969, the summer of Woodstock and Apollo 11. And if you'd said 50 years later, the only way America gets to the International Space Station is on a contractor's rocket, you would have been laughed out of Johnson Space Center.
But if it can be done with NASA,
and now, Elon
right?
Musk does it, and he lands the freaking rocket again. How amazing! How green of him!
We failed.
He recycles. If we had depended on the United Launch Alliance, which is some bullshit alliance between Boeing and Lockheed Martin, you'd have the same stupidity, spending more and more and more.
Blowing up every rocket that you shoot into space.
So really, NASA will just become a regulator, almost like the FAA. NASA, thank God, NASA is going to get out of the rocket business, leave it to private industry.
So you're saying that is a model.
It changes the model of what is inherently governmental. I'm not trying to privatize the entire military.
Right.
No, there's absolutely a place for conventional and special operations, uniformed forces that do the fighting for America, mostly the deterring. Because we want a military that is so vicious and so fearsome that no enemy wants to mess. But when you have 30 years of screw-ups everywhere that we engage, managing conflict, not ending conflict, you have enemies that will probe and test. The foreign policy of the United States should be that our enemies fear us, our friends love us, and our rivals respect us. Right now, our friends worry about our self-immolation. Like, what the hell are the Americans doing? They're destroying themselves. Our rivals are consuming us, and our enemies are shooting at us without consequence. The Houthis, okay, death to America, victory of Islam. That's what they say every time they shoot missiles at our ships. And they're not being destroyed. Because again, the very conventional Pentagon lacks any historical perspective and any innovation to get after them the way the private sector did in the 60s. We'll do another segment on Yemen next time.
And that declaration...
the article is long because the list of failures is long. I wrote that thing off the top of my head out of anger. This needs to be fixed.
Sure.
The United States of America deserves better leadership in our foreign policy realm because 30 years of failure is not cutting it.
You heard it here. You've got to go to im1776.com, im1776.com, or check out Erik's Twitter.
Real Erik D. Prince, E-R-I-K, D as in Delta, Prince.
And you'll find it there. But look, this has been an excellent series, but there's so much more you can learn if you digest the article. Too Big to Win, How the Military-Industrial Complex and the Neocons Keep America Losing. Check it out for yourself. You get a whole education out of this piece. This is why we wanted to do a brief series on it. We barely scratched the surface. There's a lot to learn. And this is very, very important for where we're going from here, because we've got to end this generational era of the industrialists and the neocons controlling our foreign policy, and, you know, to the detriment of our soldiers, you know, our airmen, you know, all of our military.
Sovereignty and our credibility.
Yeah, indeed. You heard it here. Check it out. We appreciate you being with us. This is Off Leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. Until next time.
And go order an unplugged phone.
Unplugged.com/offleash. We've got orders ready to come out, 10,000 of them.
We just got 10,000
today.
in. Giddy up.
Go get unplugged.com. All right, thanks for joining us. Till next time.